Hello and welcome to this summer's Global Journalism Seminar Series at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford. I'm Mira Selva. I'll chair these sessions, which this term in particular will focus on storytelling, investigations, and the actual heart of journalism. We start this week with Hassan Hassan and Kareem Shaheen from New Lines, one of the most interesting outlets reporting out of the Middle East at the moment. I run the Journalist Fellowship Programme at the Reuters Institute, and the Middle East is one of the most important regions and also one of the most difficult areas to look at, not least because being a journalist there is difficult and dangerous, as the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi highlights. So I feel it's incredibly important to have this conversation this week, ahead of World Press Freedom Day on 4th of May, to talk about the future of independent journalism in the Middle East, what it may look like, who will produce it, who will read it, and who will fund it. Hassan Hassan, the editor-in-chief of New Lines, has written for The Atlantic, The Guardian and Foreign Policy, and is the co-author with Michael Weiss of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror. He's now based in Washington, D.C., and his colleague Kareem Shaheen was Middle East and Turkey correspondent for The Guardian and now lives in Montreal. Welcome to both of you, Ramadan Kareem. I'm very pleased you can both join us. It's unusual to have two speakers here, so let me just outline what will happen. Hassan will give us a short presentation about New Lines and bring in Kareem, who I've been told is a funny one, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Please do type them into the Q&A box, and away we go. Over to you, Hassan.
Hey, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending. It's always a pleasure to talk about New Lines. Maybe just start with the name. The idea started as kind of inspired by the events, the sweeping events that happened in 2011 in the Middle East, and the idea is that I started my career as an opinion writer in 2011. So with the events, I had been covering the region before that for some years. The one challenge that I always had was basically how views about the region and the way that things things are covered in the region sometimes depend on views that were outdated, old news, old perceptions, old understanding of the region, but also how the region is covered. So New Lines captures that idea that there are new philosophical lines, new border lines, new political changes and lines that happened over the past decade, not just in the Middle East, but also across Europe, the United States, and on a global level. So the magazine captures that idea that we need to start tackling the world and the ideas and stories in a new way by bringing in people directly affected by these stories. And again, this is not just about the Middle East, but really it's a global story. That's kind of the overall philosophical idea behind New Lines. But also at the same time, it tackles an old problem, which is that how the Middle East is covered. There, we noticed an obvious gap in, for example, deep dive journalism, deeply reported stories, direct personal, historical, and local stories that need to be brought up and basically published in a very professional and mainstream type of journalism. So we identified a gap, and the way we did that is basically we started from this basic idea that the world has changed and that we have to not rely on old ideas and old journalists and not old as in like old in age, but as in people who think of the world through the prism of the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s. I think you've succeeded in doing some of that. The gap I talked about is that mainstream media, great mainstream media in the West. We learned so much from it. A lot of our editors and writers have come and learned from the great work that Reuters, the other wires, New York Times, Washington Post, New Yorker, and others, Atlantic and other great media that exist today. But the reality is that these media have always focused on the big stories that more or less happen in the West or within the interest of Western countries in general. Um, Again, we're kind of walking a fine line where we are presenting familiar journalism, meaning like it's done in the same way that you find it in New Yorker and Atlantic. That's at least how we aspire to do our work, New York Times and Washington Post and others. But at the same time, in terms of bandwidth, we think, and this is an important thing. Actually, this is really interesting as a journalist who has been working in journalism for over a decade. Something I learned from the 6 months since we launched New Lines is that this view that readers don't have attention span, and then they don't read deep dive, complicated stories. Uh, we found that to be untrue. Within 6 months of existence, we have found that there are a lot of people really passionate. They want to read about the Middle East. They want to read about beyond the Middle East, from Haiti, we did stories, Puerto Rico, from Cuba, from China, all the way from India, and so on. But also, not just in numbers, that a lot of people read these stories, but people spend a lot of time on the stories. So if a story takes 20 minutes, you find that the average readership of that article is around 20 minutes. So that's kind of just belies the idea that readers need snappy stories. Give them 400 words, 600 words, 1,200 words. That's the usual formats in media today. They will read it and move on to other stories, and that's how you get the readers to read stories. So that's kind of one of the important insights we found. We found also that there's great talent, and Kareem will talk about some of these things. That aspect and other aspects is that we have talents that not just, sometimes they just need a little bit of help and patience, where you need to go and explore who knows best about a certain story, rather than who do I know who can do that story. And I think sometimes that's dictated by the imperatives of day-to-day journalism, where you have to produce 10 stories or so, or even more, as an editor. So you don't have time to kind of call people all day long and try to explore what's on their mind, how the story can handle, and so on and so forth. Sometimes a story we do, and again, Kareem will talk about this, takes months to produce, weeks, months to produce, and that's really the secret sauce essentially to what we do, is that we brought in people who know the region very well, know their expertise beyond the region, it doesn't have to be the region. But also because they know the region and they know the topic, they know who is best at it at a given topic. And that's how you sort of identify talents and get the best at every given story. So if it's about Mosul, you go to someone who has been living in Mosul throughout the 90s, the early 2000s, and under ISIS, to write the stories about 3 eras of life under Mosul, under Saddam Hussein, under American occupation, and under ISIS occupation. And so on. So that's just an example. And I think we're grateful that we have succeeded in kind of capturing exactly the audience that we want. We're focusing less on quantity and more on quality, both in terms of what we produce, but also the type of people who read our stories. I'll move it over to Kareem, who will talk more about some of this granular stuff.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having us, Mira, and I really appreciate being invited onto this this wonderful and prestigious series, and we're both really proud to be here. We're talking in the lead up of how excited we were to be a part of this, and so thank you so much for inviting us. And I think it's, like Hassan said, testament to the fact that we've broken through a little bit, and we're very proud of the work we've done so far. I want to touch on a couple of things. One of them that Hassan talked briefly about, and another that I particularly am passionate about. The first one, look, I was on the receiving end of what it meant to be an Arab Middle Eastern journalist in the Middle East, working for a big mainstream publication. I reported for The Guardian starting in 2015, early 2015 till mid 2018, where I was covering mostly Syria, Yemen to a certain extent, Lebanon, Jordan, and then Turkey as well. And one of the key issues with mainstream Western journalism in the Middle East is the fact that it's under-resourced. I'm like Hassan said, I got to work alongside a lot of the incredible, frankly, foreign correspondents who've been covering Syria in particular, for the last decade, since the conflict began, and they're absolutely incredible journalists, and I've learned so much from them. But they're hampered by the fact that they have to cover so many different conflicts and stories. As a correspondent for The Guardian myself, me and my colleague, Martin Chulov at the time, we were covering a broad swath of territory that went, from the Gulf to the Atlantic, from Yemen in the south to Turkey, up north, and so there's only so much you can do, in terms of the non-breaking sort of bigger picture geopolitical stories that are unfolding in the region on a day-to-day basis. And credit to The Guardian is that they always gave me the resources and the wherewithal to be able to report on those stories. But it's such a sorely lacking aspect of journalism in the region, because of the fact that a lot of newspapers are closing their foreign bureaus. They don't have the space or time or resources to commission all these incredible stories happening in the region. And one of the issues I had when I was trying to break into the industry as a local journalist, first for the local press, is that most of the younger local journalists from the region tend to get their start with these publications not as actual reporters, but as fixers, as news assistants, where we tend to go there and do translations, do research for interviews, do all of that preparatory work so the other correspondents can actually do the stories themselves. And and I resisted that impulse when I was first starting out to be hired to do that, and was rewarded with the opportunity to work with The Guardian as a correspondent. And but a lot of my colleagues had to take that initial step. And what I realized was always that whenever I had conversations with colleagues who were doing these jobs, is that they had such an incredible eye for really fascinating stories that they were not getting the opportunity to do with their media outlets and with their newspapers. And on top of that, there was obviously the insecurity of being contract workers rather than full-time staff a lot of the time, and sort of the lack of job stability that went with that. And so when Hassan came to me with this idea that hey, we might launch this magazine where we kind of report on all these underreported stories in the region, give them depth and color and subtlety and clarity, while also paying very competitive rate to freelance journalists from the region. And my job would be to find those journalists and commission them. It really just kind of lit up all of the correct parts of my brain, and it was such a fantastic opportunity to be able to pay journalists to be journalists, and to kind of give them the opportunity to report on a lot of those stories that have gone undercovered, because of the fact that they don't have a place or as much influence or as much presence in Western media outlets as they should, in reportage from the region. So that's one aspect that I want to talk about. The other aspect is, you mentioned World Press Freedom Day coming up, and the Middle East is we have, I think, 3 of the top 4 countries for journalists who are in detention or who are arrested, and that's Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, along with China, the top 4. And this has been the case, for a few years running now. I spent a lot of time reporting on press freedom abuses and arrests of journalists in the Middle East and in Turkey. And I just wanted to say, the amazing thing about the last 10 years is that they sort of led to this incredible sentiment and this incredible spirit for debate bubbling up throughout the region. And what happened instead was Arab autocrats backed by Western countries and Western allies and Eastern allies too, have actually been resurgent. They've led this charge of counter-revolution that has actually meant that they are even more entrenched in place and even more tyrannical in their approach dealing with dissent. And so there's this incredible appetite for free and independent media from the region, at the exact moment when it's almost impossible to have free and independent media from the region. I've spent the last couple of years working with independent media that covers the Middle East, and it's such a challenging environment because of the fact that the space for debate is so lacking and so absent, in whether it's in coverage of the region itself or coverage from the region. And there's great risk to doing the work that our journalists at New Lines do on a day-to-day basis. And part of the problem is the fact that it's an under-resourced avenue. It's not that safe for people to be reporting from a lot of these places. So I think New Lines kind of enters into this arena at a moment where there is great need for independent journalism from the region, and so I'm really proud to be part of it, and joyful, in fact, to be part of it, because like I said, we just get to work on a day-to-day basis with local journalists from the region that I knew on a personal level, and that I had worked with, and that I know have incredible stories to tell, and just don't have the space or the resources to tell them elsewhere.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your kind of thoughts and your expertise on this. I've one question, Hassan. You talked about the readers and how engaged they are and how long they spend on each story. Who are they? I'd just be interested to know what the profile of the readers are, where they're based, how they divide by age, and also where you see the kind of financial viability of this as an enterprise going forward.
Sure. So I don't have the detailed kind of breakdown of these things, but in terms of countries, we know that we have large readers from the United States, but that's partly also could be VPN, because usually if you don't know where they come from, they might be from the US. But we have a lot from Europe. We almost have readers from all the from everywhere, but the major countries, let's say in the top 10, would be we have a lot from India, South Asia in general. We have Middle East, some countries in the Middle East, especially the Gulf, and we have from the US and Europe.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
but
could you talk?
I don't have the breakdown exactly.
Okay.
And in terms of financial, so we're lucky that the idea started from where I work in an institute, the think tank in DC, and the idea has always been on my mind to create something like this. And the choice was in 2019 was, do I leave my think tank work and go and do this passion project that I always wanted to, and that would require fundraising. There were a lot of interest by just talking to people who are interested in this field, Middle East, in the United States, because we made a point to, keep it in the Middle East, because the secret to the success of an endeavor like ours is not to be attached to any political agenda. And this is something we, or not just a political agenda as in like a party, but also in terms of the ideology of what we write and what we choose to write. And something we emphasize from day one is, and even the form the kind of the style of writing we have prohibits a little bit activism, because it's deep dive stories. Usually polemics come from like op-ed writing. So someone has an opinion, they write for an op-ed on something, and it tends to be polemical. But the idea that we established from early on is that if you do long form journalism, deep dive stories that just focus on the story and on the idea, and develop that idea or develop that story, rather than present an opinion and just push that opinion, you minimize, you don't eliminate, but you minimize bias. So that was also in terms of funding, like we didn't want anything that can dictate a bias or a prohibition of any sort. So that's when I start talking about the idea. We already developed in the think tank as a great venue for people who are not present in Washington, D.C. discussions. We start to bring people like the late Hisham al-Hashimi, that Iraqi scholar who was murdered a year ago by Shia militias in Baghdad. just because he was writing about them. And we brought him just before he was dead, he was killed, to write for us more regularly, and that required a lot of work, and that was good experience before we launched New Lines. And because of that sort of success on the think tank level, the idea of starting New Lines within the think tank started to be appealing to the center and the leadership of the center and so on and so forth. So for now, we're not thinking of kind of making money out of it. We're kind of lucky that we have enough funding, enough resources internally to do this. It's not a very expensive operation. So we're good, I think, for the foreseeable future in that regard. But we are thinking, obviously, of long-term sustainability. We don't want to kind of go to the route of basically imposing on our readers that now we stop giving you the content that we have. I think we're not thinking of doing that anytime soon.
So you're not thinking along the lines of paywalls or subscription models. It's
No.
something you want to keep free to air. On that note, all your content at the moment is in English, as far as I can see. Are there any thoughts about translating into any other languages, especially Arabic?
We have a lot of interest now. A lot of our stories actually get translated voluntarily by various Arabic sites. When it comes to Libya, they translate in Libya by Libyan sites. The same thing for other places. So we are happy that we're allowing people to just translate the work. We don't, have exclusive contracts. Although people have approached us to kind of just publish our content and into Arabic. We have a lot of Spanish and Italian translations as well of stories.
That goes to the next question, actually, which somebody asked about Latin American readership. They said there must be a market there.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the media, I mean, we started from, like I said, focus on the quality of stories, and we are interested in the world. We are based in DC, and we think of ourselves as an American publication, but focused on specific areas from different parts of the world. And we rely on people who know specific areas to kind of produce the work. So we think there is a gap in Latin America, yes. There is appetite for readership, especially from like in English and the way we do it. South Asia also, we have very successful magazines that existed for like three decades and now died out. Just one major Pakistani, for example, newspaper magazine, which happened to also be called Newsline. It's kind of we are New Lines, but they called Newsline. Which is, people confuse the two names. Also shut down last year after like 3-4 decades of existence. So we have a lot of readers coming to us from, like I said, Afghanistan, Pakistan, from India, from Latin America, just because, we're not covering these areas just as news. We're covering them also as local stories.
Thank you.
So if you have any stories from Latin America, please pitch them to us.
Kareem, let me take that point and bring it to you about using local reporters. And you're absolutely right that model of parachute journalism, where you get Western correspondents coming in and then using the local journalists as fixers, is one that's problematic on lots of levels. And it's very good to see that model changing. We also have a quite ongoing conversation of objectivity, and the general consensus in the kind of this seminar series is there's no real such thing as objectivity. Everyone brings their own, experiences and viewpoints to the story. So the idea that you can't have local journalists telling their stories is nonsense. I would ask, though, in particularly in contested areas such as Yemen, there's two issues. It's a very divided society, and it's also a very dangerous society to report if you are from one community to go and report in another community. How do you view that, and how do you kind of balance that when you look for reporters?
Yeah, so can I actually, before I answer that question, can I make a brief sort of a comment about the funding models aspect? So one interesting thing about the region is the fact that if you follow the media and what's happening in the region in general, there's mostly the mainstream media outlets that are present or that are available are ones that are either owned directly by the government or that are loyalists in the sense that they're owned by private businessmen, private interests that are linked to the government somehow. They're usually businessmen, so as part of an oligarchy, who are able to operate in that sort of space, with the explicit agreement of the government. This is the reason why there is such an appetite for independent Arab media, right? And but because of the fact that they don't have the licensing or the space, or they're probably going to get sued out of existence, if they try to operate in Turkey or in Egypt, for example. This is why alternative independent media has emerged. And just to kind of put in context, New Lines' funding, the way most independent media outlets are funded that are operating in the Middle East or that are explicitly aimed at the Middle East or covering the Middle East is generally either through foundations, which are there are a few kind of common players or that fund a lot of independent media organizations operating in the Middle East, and this includes some sort of usual suspects or usual names, like Open Society Foundations, like in France, CFI. Like in Germany, Heinrich Boll and a bunch of others, as well as the EU, and various sort of organs within the EU. So this is the way most independent media outlets of the Arab world are funded. The other option is for them to be able to find sort of reader subscriber base that will pay for their journalism, but it's still way too early in the Arab world for that, and I'm not sure when I'll be able to see a point where an Arab media outlet can be simply sustained through subscriptions by Arab readers, primarily because they don't have the same purchasing power as Western readers more broadly. And so I feel in an important way, it's really important to actually make sure that a lot of this content is freely available, at least to Middle Eastern readers, because for the most part it's really they don't have the resources to be able to fund this sort of journalism themselves, and so that's why a lot of alternative funding models that may seem a little bit odd or strange to people working in mainstream media outlets or people who are mostly familiar with mainstream media outlets, might find it odd. And this does not imply the sort of editorial dependence. The terms of all of this is that you're free to continue doing whatever it is that you're doing, but we recognize that this is sort of an industry that's still in its infancy and needs to be able to experiment and do some trial and error, before it achieves a level of maturity that allows it to draw on a wider base of readers that would allow that sort of funding that's familiar to Western media outlets and mainstream media outlets in general. Regarding the question of objectivity, it's really I'm really glad you brought it up, because I remember when this is back in 2017, I was covering Syria for The Guardian, and actually earlier this month, 4 years ago, there was a chemical attack that took place in the Syrian town of Khan Sheikhoun, and I was asked to go report on it for The Guardian, and I ended up being the only journalist from outside Syria, to go and report on it, from the ground. And one of the interesting critiques or responses to my reporting from there, which was also aired by a former British diplomat who was speaking on the BBC the next day when I came back from Syria and published the story, was that this is we can't really trust him because he's he's not a foreign correspondent, right? He's not a Western correspondent, and so this is something we've had to deal with for a long time, and it's unfortunately it's partly racist, but it's also partly the legacy of the way our governments have controlled the media for so long in the region, and how they've essentially forced this sort of ownership model of Arab media. And so the perception of a lot of people who come to the region is that Arab media outlets are untrustworthy, and the journalists operating there are somehow in the pay of the government, and it's something that even Arabs harbor within themselves towards journalists. I remember when my fiance was introducing me to her father, and he asked her what I did, and I said I was a journalist. He asked her, well, what does he do from 9 to 5? So there's this assumption that a lot of Arab journalists are going to be stenographers for the government. In terms of the objectivity argument, I agree with with the previous panelists that have that you mentioned, that there isn't really, you kind of come with a perspective, and you just and by virtue of who you select, to talk to in your stories and who you're going to end up quoting, this sense of objectivity is doesn't exist in that way. And for me, one of the helpful things was the fact that I was an Arab who wasn't really reporting on Egypt itself. As a journalist, I was reporting from from Lebanon, from Syria, from Jordan, from all these places, and especially in Lebanon, being an Egyptian, people tended to not ascribe any of the sectarian issues that tend to plague the country to me. I was able to flit into Shia-controlled areas, cover fighting on both sides of Sunni Alawite battle line in Tripoli, without causing a lot of people to be upset or to raise hackles around it. I was able to report from places that frankly some of my Lebanese colleagues didn't want to go report from, because they didn't feel as safe going into for example, an area that's that is controlled by Hezbollah in Lebanon, when they were Christian or they were Sunni, and particularly after a traumatic event like a suicide bombing or something like that. And so I was asked to report on a lot of those stories myself, and to go in and to cover them. And I'm not sure I have the best answer to that question. It's something that we kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis. But I do think that rather than objectivity, I think we as individual journalists and as editors, what we need to be guided by is this age-old journalistic trope of the truth. It's we just sort of let it lead us where we may. Trying to suppress the idea that we have opinions and we have feelings and we have ideas about how the world should be. That should not prevent us from being journalists, and we are going to have those feelings and those emotions towards some of the stories we cover, particularly if we're local journalists from those areas, and that's okay, as long as we let the facts guide us towards whatever it is that we uncover and that we find out. And the incredible thing about commissioning local journalists for New Lines has been that it's actually not trying to tell them what the story is. From our perspective, it's actually cultivating and recruiting this talent and asking them to tell us what the story is, and then working with that instead of trying to tell it to them from our perch in the West right now.
Have you been surprised by anything in that line, stories that they've suggested to you that you thought that was unexpected?
Well, it's less so the reportage and more so the sort of delightful kind of news adjacent stories are always the ones that I've loved kind of commissioning and reading and working with them on. We have a few big stories coming up, and Hassan can maybe talk a bit more about the coverage over the last couple of weeks, which has really kind of helped us break into the public consciousness in the U.S. and in policymaking circles in the Middle East as well. But I've mostly been particularly delighted by some of the stories. Apologies if there's any noise in the background. So the travelogue stories, the cultural stories. We had a story recently about the origins of Turkish names. Which talked about how names can be sort of a signifier of political and religious belief in Turkey. We had a piece that constituted travelogues by Turks going to America in the 1950s and the 1940s, and sort of bringing back their impressions not only of America but of all the diaspora communities that had fled the Ottoman Empire. Like the Armenians, at the end of the First World War, and who had, by that point had spent decades living in Turkey, and the perceptions of some of these, Turkish visitors to the U.S., and conversing with these Armenians and these Greeks who had fled their country but still yearned for it, was such a powerful reminder of what what life was like for them, and what it means to belong somewhere, and what it means to be rejected by that place you come from, but still yearn for it. So some of those stories in particular the stories that are anchored in historical moments and events, have been for me the most informative and the most educational. as far as I'm concerned. But the reporting on the ground too has been, stories that have delighted me, have frightened me, have upset me. We had a piece last week about the Kuwaiti, Me Too movement that emerged, as a response to domestic violence and to violence against women in general in Kuwait, and we happened to publish it on the same week as a really tragic story emerged of a woman who'd been brutally murdered by a harasser who tried to propose to her and was rejected by the family, and it really just sort of highlighted how, and nobody covers Kuwait, nobody covers Kuwait in the mainstream press, and it reminded me of how those stories that we're doing from there, by listening to these local journalists and not trying to tell them what to do, but really trying to help refine the stories that they're doing and their journalistic process, how it can pay a lot of dividends.
I do love this idea that you paint a picture of these countries in the language and the kind of imagery that is of direct relevance to the people who live there. And you can do that from abroad, or you can do it from home, but it creates home for many people who want home. It's beautiful. Thank you. Hassan, can I go to you, please, to talk a little bit about the reporting in the last few weeks that Kareem mentioned that seems to have broken through into US policy circles. If you could talk a little bit about that, would be great. Thank you. And also a question from Ipsita Chakravarti, one of our journalist fellows from India, saying, could you talk a little bit more about the new philosophical lines or borderlines that you mentioned in your opening statements, and how that's different to what prevailed in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s?
Yeah, absolutely. So, something we've been thinking about doing for a while, which is basically also getting into reportage, stories, dispatches, and things like that. And we've been doing like some of these like investigations and things. And, been in existence again for like 6 months. And now we're on a path to kind of diversify the diet instead of just kind of long form stories and ideas and such. We're breaking into kind of that. The idea is always that as the way we do things, like we kind of provide stories or publish stories. It might be seen more like as a magazine, while if you do investigations and others, you break into the current affairs and you're part of the debate that's ongoing now. And I think we've achieved that over the past month, but particularly over the past 2-3 weeks. So we're glad, we're very happy with how things are developing and evolving. Every week is more exciting content, as everyone in the team read the story sometimes more than once, obviously by nature of working with each other collaboratively. And you never get bored of like, I don't want to read that story. It's always like really interesting, always educational, always learning. And that's a measure. Like once you start being bored of your own stories, then that's you expect others to be bored. And I think we're nowhere there. We have like a diverse kind of stories, and something we want to emphasize. We talk about local stories. We are not exclusive to local people, as in people, native reporters. We do welcome, in fact, we have a lot of content from people who have this intimate relationship with different places they lived in or worked in. So a long-standing kind of diplomat might write a story about their experience in Lebanon or Israel or elsewhere, right? And we've done some of these great stories. Now, our format allows for a space and has the bandwidth for stories, for like someone like a diplomat to write instead of an op-ed about a reaction story to an event, but to have like 3,000 words, sometimes 4,000 words, to go deep into their story, more like a notebook or cables or something like that, and just tell the story and provide the insights without being rushed and say, can you stop writing? Just like it's there's space, there's bandwidth. So we want to kind of always emphasize that we're not just for kind of people born in Egypt, born in Syria, born in Lebanon. No, in fact, we do welcome and encourage, and we actually look for people who are from outside, because we don't want to be also hostage to our own perspectives. That's important, but we want to kind of get people to write about their own perspective, which are sometimes really more useful because you come from a different country, you experience that country in a different place or that space or that issue or that idea in a different place, different things, and sometimes it's really fascinating. So that balance is very important for us. We always emphasize that we're also not just the Middle East, we want stories from elsewhere. And to go back to the second to that question, which is also relevant elsewhere, that new philosophical lines. What I mean by that is not philosophical, but like it could be political lines, social lines, religious lines, because the uprisings in the Arab, I'm just talking about the Middle East now and then move elsewhere. The uprisings that erupted and broke out in 2011 changed things in ways, changed perceptions, perspectives, brought up new movements, brought to power, even temporarily, opposition, civil society organizations that existed before for a brief period of time, sometimes in Tunisia for longer period of times. We saw that regimes in the Middle East shaken up, but also seeing the worst of them, as in like how they react to opposition, and when they were defeated, how they come back. So along these lines, we have started to see also, even on a religious level, we have groups like Sufist or Salafist and others who have been transformed by these events, because they were, for the first time often, have been in a situation where they have to respond to a political situation they're not trained to respond to, because they were busy kind of neighborhood reform or religious circles and things like that. But now they sometimes, like in Yemen and Libya, pacifist Salafist organizations started to pick up arms and fight for this warlord and that warlord, and how that transformed some of these ideas. And we started to see, groups like ISIS and others. And I think with these things, you started to see, okay, so the world is changing on different levels. The refugee crisis in Syria also changed Europe, you could say. That brought up new movements, the rise of the far right, the coming of Trump, for example. All these things were unthinkable like a decade ago, and now they're there, and they're still playing out. They're not going to go away. They are going to stay for like another generation, where we don't know the extent, for example, of the destruction that ISIS brought to Iraq and Syria, and the mass killing of Yazidis and fellow Muslims and fellow Sunnis in some places. What's the long-term effect of this trauma? What's the effect of Assad winning, for example, if you want to call it? What's the effect of Sisi taking control and transforming Egypt in a way that his predecessors never could or were able to do in many ways, and so on. So these changes are happening, and we want to kind of make sense of these changes.
And one other big change we saw in the Middle East and all over the world after 2011 in particular was the impact of social media on public discourse and public actions and political discourse.
Right.
Can I ask either of you, Kareem or Hassan, how much is that kind of influencing your reporting? I get the sense that the new generation of reporters are almost the first ones to truly understand how social media is working. And in a way, it's great that organizations like New Lines can bring these people into the public arena as well.
I mean, Kareem can handle that question. He's younger than me, but also he works in satire and other formats that appeal to the young.
Kareem.
Yeah, I mean, so as both with New Lines and with kind of other Arabic media work that I do, social media is just absolutely essential, as a tool for reaching out to people, as a tool for finding people to write. The reality is, as we spoke earlier, people are sick of mainstream media outlets, mainstream Arab media outlets, because they understand that there are for the most part, in the pay of the regimes, that they don't do independent journalism, that they're, cannot be trusted to sort of portray the, the reality of the situation, as it should be. And this is, it's a huge problem when it comes to having, like, public health crisis, like the coronavirus, for example. If you kind of want to look a little bit at some of the the problematic aspects of having a distrusted media environment, is, people will turn to social media, will turn to a lot of the conspiracy theories that get spread on social media, and there obviously isn't, as much moderation on, the Arabic side of things as there is on English disinformation and things like that, on Facebook and Twitter and other social media outlets. But it has been a way for independent outlets like ours and like other independent Arabic media outlets to reach out and to find audiences. The problem, though, comes with the fact that these social media outlets can sometimes be menaces to society. They can be these vehicles for spreading disinformation, and they also make it really hard for independent media outlets like ours to truly break out and to reach as many people as possible, because of the fact that they're constantly changing their algorithms. And so on your website, you're in control of the end user experience, but on these social media outlets, you're really at the mercy of their algorithms and what they decide to promote and what they decide not to. And so that's one side of it. But like I said, I think we simply can't do without them in the Middle East at the moment, because websites get blocked every now and then if they go too far against the government lines in various parts of the Middle East. It can be really difficult to reach an audience that's primarily used to consuming media traditionally through newspapers, even print newspapers. The websites that they know are generally government websites, unless they have particular interests in the coverage of around a certain story or around a certain country in the region, that then they'll go to. For example, if you read about what happens in Syria on a regular basis, you might have developed the media habits to consume independent media, that, or media that's more affiliated with the opposition than the regime sources. But in general, most people tend to not know of the existence of these independent media outlets, or how to reach them except through social media. They don't have the space to engage with that content and to talk about these stories with other like-minded people except on social media outlets. And we actually saw a really fascinating trend when Clubhouse launched recently in the Middle East, and obviously got blocked in a couple of countries. Some of them made it just so unbearably slow without actually blocking it to discourage people from going on. But frankly, the smarter ones, ended up using it as a way to propagate their own beliefs, as a propaganda outlet. We actually saw an explosion in the first few weeks on Clubhouse when it launched, or sort of launched more broadly, was really incredibly exhilarating if you were someone who was consuming the Arabic language rooms that were on there, because all of a sudden it felt like the pent-up frustration of having 10 years where you couldn't say what you think, and on top of it, the pent-up frustration of a year of the pandemic without being able to meet up with your close friends to sound off to them, kind of met together in this incredible amalgamation, and there was just an explosion of rooms about every topic under the sun, from the political situations of all these various countries in the region to feminism, to LGBT rights, to secularism versus religion, to dream interpretations, to live sort of musical performances and auditions. It was just absolutely exhilarating, and it shows you just how much of an appetite there is for people to consume stories about them, for people to talk about those stories with each other about them, to just have a space to talk about all those important identity questions and political questions and social questions that we just don't have spaces for, and that only social media really has the outlet for.
Absolutely. Can I ask you, you mentioned conspiracy theories and kind of misinformation on social media. And can I ask if New Lines has a policy for dealing with this? Do you try to do fact checking? What do you do when there's misinformation out there? Do you try and rebut it? Do you ignore it? Because what do you do when the politicians themselves spread it?
I think I'll let Hassan answer that because he's tried unsuccessfully to rein me in when it comes to dealing with trolls on social media. But you know, I will just say one thing about it is that you know, there's just so much noise, right? So much of that, you know, when it comes to the Middle East in particular. You know, whether that's from, you know, conspiracy theorists in the West or conspiracy theorists in the Arab world, but also because there is so much technology now that enables a lot of these regimes to flood, you know, the social media outlets with their own version of reality that has, you know, no connection with actual reality. They employ, you know, huge, enormous bot networks. They employ, you know, very sophisticated disinformation and surveillance tactics. You know, and so for the most part, you know, when I do see constructive criticism on social media, I'm really excited, frankly, to engage with it because it's intellectually stimulating, and it's really interesting and it's really fascinating to engage with it. You know, even conspiracy theories, because you know, who among us hasn't you know, been a part of a conversation in the Middle East, you know, either in a taxi ride or in a conversation with family, or you know, meeting random people in the street, or you know, people we're interviewing. Who haven't, you know, who didn't have, you know, a conspiracy theory to you know, to argue for, and to argue that it explains the world. And in particular, you know, I was having this conversation with a friend earlier about, you know, whether conspiracy theories tend to propagate more in the West or in the Middle East. And, you know, and I made the argument that, you know, we have more things that we want to explain away, you know, because we don't have as much control over, you know, our destinies. And so, you know, we have a lot more of those stories that need to be explained away, and we need to make sense of. And if the reality is difficult enough, we can't really come up with as many, you know, realistic explanations of it. But the point is that there are so many sophisticated ways of propagating these falsehoods on social media now, that the hardest part of it is actually trying to determine what's honest criticism and what's just trolling.
Thank you. Hassan, did you want to add to that?
No, on the contrary. So I had my fair share of fights on Twitter for like a decade since Twitter became a thing. But I learned along the way that maybe arguing over Twitter is not always. I mean, it's never productive. You never leave Twitter where someone says, "Oh, yo, I see your point. You know, I'm walking away with something new I learned." But I still think, you know, I agree with Kareem. You still need to engage with some of these stories. Conspiracy theories, though. So we have had a fair share of like conspiracy theories. When we launched first, we started as a Muslim Brotherhood organization. That's a conspiracy theory. And then and now we ended up with being CIA agents. So it moved from being Muslim Brotherhood to CIA agents within 6 months. I don't know what we're going to be in 6 months, 6 months down the line. But
they, what diversified income is.
Exactly. So we are, you know, these conspiracy things tend to cancel each other out. So by the end of it, it's like, you know, they are opposed to each other. But no, conspiracy theories, and like in terms of, there's other question of fact checking and how we deal with stories. Especially there's a risk here that we are inviting people from across the world to write their stories and pitch to us and things like that. And often verification becomes a problem. How do you know that person is a real person? Because over the past 5 years, especially, there's been many cases of people writing under fake name with a fake profile. They build a profile and they start to pitch to, you know, bigger outlets. So it is a challenge, and we're trying various ways to make sure that the person writing is a real, first of all, is a real person, but also back and forth testing the ideas, and the engagement takes weeks sometimes. So by the end of it, we, and that's rare so far, but it happens like one twice until you find.
It's an absolute risk for a new organization with a network of freelancers globally, as you said. And can I just go to one of our questions from Tor, so a Norwegian fellow, talking about one specific, your specific reporting, saying in Norway, many believe it was the United States that helped create the Taliban and Al Qaeda by financing the Mujahideen during the Afghanistan war. What reactions have you had to your article where you tried to just prove this happened? You did a kind of long fact-based reporting on Afghanistan. We're just wondering what the feedback has been and what reactions you've had.
I lost the internet a little bit. Maybe
Yeah.
Kareem can take.
Kareem, did you hear the question?
So the question was about the specific reportage on the Afghanistan story, which I think Hassan actually worked on more than me, so he might be in a better position to answer that particular question.
So yeah, sorry, I lost like.
It was just what reaction have you had to the story on Afghanistan and the kind of the.
So that's one of the stories we're really most proud of, because we have a reporter who went to an area, a Taliban area, and he came back with the story. That's obviously usual for journalists to do, but unlike usually where you have like someone who is a foreigner, who's not like from that country, it doesn't have to be a foreigner, sometimes from neighboring countries, go there. This is a person who knows the area already so much. And, it's like if I go to back to my village back in Eastern Syria and report on how that area changed over the past decade, so that was really, I read it at least twice or three times, just kind of thoroughly to absorb the depth and kind of the insights there. It's the kind of stories we want. We're not privileging native, writers, but I mean we do, but we're not just exclusive to those, but also we privilege the knowledge. If someone knows so much about an area and goes there with that perspective, and comes back with an interesting story, that's good. It counters, and I think Kareem referred to it, and I heard it also from editors. The idea sometimes you want to send someone to Iraq or even Dubai to do a specific story. Editors deliberately sometimes pick someone with fresh eyes, like basically to go there, not knowing anything about the country, to go and start digging for a certain story. That is a journalism philosophy, where you send someone who doesn't know anything to come back with a story, like that. We don't do that. We invest so much in people who know, like I said, doesn't have to be from the area, to kind of go and do stories that tell us something. I need to learn something from every story we publish, much less the reader and others.
Thank you.
Can I just add a little comment here, Mira? Just on the question of almost revisionist sort of interpretations on events and historical events in particular. I think I wouldn't say we're revisionists on a lot of these questions, but I think we do, because we do give spaces to voices that don't get as much credence and get to be heard as much in Western coverage of the region. What will emerge often is a more complicated story than the one a lot of people have been told. And it's not necessarily that the version that people have been told is wrong per se. It's just incomplete. It's falsehood by omission rather than by deliberate lie. And one of the I think the first essay I wrote for New Lines, as an editor, we asked the editors also to contribute their own pieces. Was a story exploring why America is a more hated superpower in the Middle East than China or Russia. Even though, if we take the sum of the tragedies that America has been involved in the Middle East, compared to, for example, more recently, the atrocities that Russia has carried out in Syria, or the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, when these are more sort of recent tragedies that are sort of more immediate. compared to, the American invasion of Iraq and prior to that, America's, involvement in overthrowing, legitimate governments in the Middle East and Iran, for example. And so it's one of those stories where actually, I'm not trying to, downplay, America's destructive role in the region, or to say that, what they did in Iraq didn't matter. But it's more to try and kind of think a little bit more about, why America has, enjoys this sort of hegemonic presence in the Arab mindset when it comes to, our reactions and our responses to its policy decisions, but we don't afford the same level of critical analysis and judgment when it comes to, the interventions of, China or Russia in the Arab and Muslim world. And so this might sometimes be perceived as sort of a revisionist approach to history, that we're, trying to rewrite events that have been established, but it's really just adding an additional dimension or complexity to them, to try and gain a better understanding as we start privileging a bit more of these, voices that have been neglected for such a long time.
Thank you. One last quick question, so we're going to run out of time, but has your site been blocked anywhere in the Middle East, as far as you're aware of? Good question, Mark, from Kenya.
Unfortunately, no.
No? You need to cause more trouble before you do.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's been absolutely illuminating hour, and I could happily carry on talking, but in the meantime, we'll keep an eye on your work going forward as well, and wish you all the very best of luck. Next week, we are going to have Manish Pandey from News Laundry with us, speaking about the farmers' protests in India. Again, incredibly topical, incredibly important to have a journalist from India speaking at this very, very difficult time for the country. So do join us. And in the meantime, Hassan and Kareem, thank you so much for your time today, and best of luck.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.